Hello, my name is Lauren Cullen, and I am a DPhil researcher in English, Language, and Literature at the University of Oxford. More specifically, my research asks who is an animal and what roles do animals play in 19th century literature? And one of the many ways I think through the representation of animal characters is by looking at animal rights discourse within and alongside literature. So thank you for joining this talk as we explore animal-human relationships in 19th century literature and culture. So our objectives today are to 1. Gain an understanding of the ways writers sought to inspire change and advocate for animals in the 19th century. 2. Engage with different literary passages about animals. And 3. Think about why and how the concepts and context explored in this talk relate to contemporary issues about animals. So what roles did animals play in 19th century society? They were pets. Dogs were an extremely popular pet, and the first Kennel Club dog show occurred in 1860. They were entertainers, so they were kept in zoos, and they also participated as objects of spectacle in circuses. P.T. Barnum, who's the star of The Greatest Showman movie, purchased Jumbo the elephant from the London Zoo in the 19th century. They were research subjects because the Victorian period experienced the rise of science as we know it today and the subsequent rise in animal experimentation. They were a source of food. They were transportation because there were no cars, so dogs, and later more popularly horses, pulled carts and carriages to move people around. They provided clothing because Victorians wore fur. Feathers were extremely fashionable, so plenty of women wore hats with feathers and birds on them. And they were a source of sport and pleasure because fox hunting, bird shooting, and trophy hunting of wild animals, and even rat baiting competitions were very popular during the 19th century. Throughout this talk, I've included activities to help us think about human-animal relationships more deeply. Later, I've attached passages from 19th century works of fiction that we'll close read together. Those texts will take a bit more time, but here, I just want you to look at these two images and have a think about what stands out to you. These are images from the Zoological Gardens in London, or the London Zoo, from the 19th century. Are these images of interactions with animals familiar to you? Do you think zoos have changed significantly since these times? How and why? So I want you to just think about that for a minute, pause the video, either jot down some ideas or just think them through in your head. Following up on the previous slide, some things that you may have noted in the images are the dangerous proximity of people to animals, the size of the exhibits, and the level of interaction that guests could have with the animals. In the 19th century, animals had far fewer rights than they do today, though animal rights are still quite limited across the globe. Individuals could touch and feed animals in zoos, own exotic animals. You could even purchase a tiger in stores such as Harrods, or from a wholesale dealer such as Jamrach's in London. And some of the wealthier population even created their own private zoos, or menageries. I've listed what I call a few key moments for animals here, and you might be surprised that I've listed not only nonfiction and scientific books, but also a work of fiction, Black Beauty, that was published in 1877. Similar to other social movements at the time, such as the women's suffrage movement and the child labor movement, individuals passionate about rights for animals found many different ways to speak about animal issues, be them, for example, through fiction, plays, letters, and petitions. Just like popular documentaries today, including Blackfish, Seaspiracy, and even Tiger King, forms of art and media work to challenge the ways in which animals were cared for, or rather mistreated, in society. Perhaps many of you will be familiar with this man. Darwin's The Origin of Species, published in 1859, had huge ramifications for relationships between humans and animals. While ideas of evolution had been explored throughout centuries, even as far back as Aristotle's time, Darwin's idea of natural selection that demonstrated how humans evolved from lower life forms contested the stark division between humans and animals, and that humans were not the only rational, thinking, and conscious species. Here is a quote from Darwin in which he says, "The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not kind." This meant for Darwin that we were all connected in some way. Another influential figure for the rights of animals preceding Darwin was Jeremy Bentham, who advocated for better animal treatment on the basis of their feeling pain. For Bentham, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? During this time, there was a staunch belief that animals were things and mechanized objects, and this was what Jeremy Bentham wanted to dispel. Likewise, Frances Power Cobb took Bentham's theory one step further, as demonstrated in this quote. She writes, "We have seen that as they are sentient beings, and so beings that can feel pain, we are bound to avoid their pain and seek their pleasure. But as they are more than sentient, and also rational and moral beings, other and higher obligations are added to those which concern their pain and pleasure." Cobb was a campaigner of women's rights and animal rights, and especially was known for advocating against vivisection, or experimenting on live animals. She created the Victoria Street Society for the Protection of Animals Liable to Vivisection in 1875, which pushed forward debates and then legislation in 1876 to regulate experimentation on animals. She was also an accomplished writer of essays and of fiction. Finally, we land on Henry Stephen Salt, considered today as the father of animal rights for his strikingly progressive position on these issues. He also wrote extensively on working conditions for and the economic vulnerability of workers and the poor, was critical of capitalism, and pointed out how wasteful and detrimental to health meat consumption could be. His book, Animal Rights Considered in Relation to Social Progress, touched on issues I'm sure many of you are familiar with today, including the ethics behind hunting for sport, eating animals, wearing fur, and keeping pets. For Salt, animal rights and human rights were intertwined. As he writes, "The emancipation of men from cruelty and injustice will bring with it, in due course, the emancipation of animals also. The two reforms are inseparable, and neither can be fully realized alone." From the examples I've given, I think it's safe to say that writers writing about animals did not exist in a bubble. Victorians were thinking about animals and many different aspects of their lives, and it should come as no surprise that the presence of animals in literature gives us a glimpse into how they thought about animals. As your first task, I've given you a passage from popular sensation fiction writer Wilkie Collins's work, Heart and Science, to read. This book was premised on the cruelty of vivisection, and so testing on live animals, and Collins corresponded with Frances Power Cobb while writing this book. I want you to take a moment to analyze this passage, so pause the video, just take a few minutes, and I want you to think about what stands out to you. I'm always struck by how graphic that passage is and how it elicits these feelings of discomfort and empathy in me as well. And here are some other key terms that I usually have at the back of my mind as I'm reading through passages about animals in literature. First, we have anthropomorphism, which is the attribution of human personality or characters to something non-human, such as an animal. And many Victorian writers were seen as controversial for depicting animals as thinking, feeling, conscious beings. In this passage, we see that the dog experiences a feeling of terror, and that is an emotion that triggers the dog to run into traffic. There's also imaginative sympathy, which is a source of empathy, feeling of compassion and or identifying with someone other than yourself. And for H.S. Salt, this was the ability to recognize the similarities between human and non-human beings. And I think Collins really aptly depicts that with the passage with Carmina saying, "If it isn't a dog, it may be a child next time." So we see the mutual vulnerability and the connection between a human and an animal. And then finally, we have sentience, which we explored with Jeremy Bentham, and that's the ability to experience sensations such as pleasure and pain, and is not necessarily related to consciousness or rationality. I'd like you to keep those terms in the back of your mind as we work through this next section of the presentation. Perhaps some of you have heard of the famous autobiography of a horse, Black Beauty. Black Beauty is a story of a horse who goes through many homes and works many jobs, including pulling fancier carriages for wealthier families to pulling cabs in London. The story is told in first person. Anna Sewell said that it was translated from the horse. And while it took as its primary focus animal welfare, the book also challenged conditions of the working class and tried to instill a broader message of kindness and empathy between human and non-humans alike. And when we look at these two images, we can also see why horses may have possibly been mistreated at this time, because horses were considered machines, transport animals. And here we have this train called the Iron Horse, just another way for us to show that kind of detachment to the emotional life of horses. I have here another passage I'd like you to look at now that you've learned a few new terms and you're comfortable with close reading. This is a passage from Black Beauty, and I want you to think about what kind of language is being used, who is speaking, and what is the effect on the reader. So take a minute, pause the slide, and think through these questions that I've asked you. Anna Sewell was celebrated for her work in abolishing the use of the bearing rein, which was a rein that was used to keep a horse's head held high, which damaged their necks but was in fashion during the Victorian period. While this book has been called anthropomorphic for using a first-person point of view, Sewell uses the technique of speaking through an animal in this passage to let us slip in to the horse's point of view, as Black Beauty details the pain of using the bearing rein. Sewell focuses on beauty as a subject in and of himself, highlighting that horses are not objects, but beings with emotions and the capacity to feel pain. This passage acknowledges both his immediate physical pain, where he talks about what it was like to foam at the mouth, and that it is a sure sign of something wrong that generally proceeds from suffering, while also commenting on his mental anguish, made explicit by the word depressed. His inferences here demonstrate Black Beauty's complex cognition, manifested in this instance in his perception, his memory, his emotions, and his own self-consciousness. When we think about the 19th century, we often think about it as the distant past, that we have progressed much further than these individuals socially, politically, culturally, economically, etc. However, I hope I've demonstrated throughout this presentation that not only were the Victorians thinking about animal issues, but the issues that they were concerned with continue to affect us today. Here I have an image from Black Beauty on the left of your screen from the 1921 edition of the novel. And in this image, we can see Black Beauty has collapsed from overwork while working as a cab horse on the streets of London. On the right, similarly, is an image of Aisha, a carriage horse who collapsed in New York in March of 2020. She subsequently had to be euthanized because of her cardiac arrest. Again, I hope following this talk, you'll think more about the ways in which you interact with animals in the world, how these views have been and continue to be informed by issues explored in the Victorian period, and how various forms of art and media today, including Netflix, have taken up the plight of animals to help animal issues reach audiences around the globe and promote a healthier, happier, and safer society for humans and non-human animals alike. So in summary, in this talk, we first learned about the roles animals play in 19th century fiction and how they were informed by and actively participated in the rise of a collective awareness of and concern for animal protection. Second, that fictional representations of animals were central to discussions surrounding pet keeping, evolutionary biology, zoos, animal experimentation, and wild animal conservation, as well as transportation, as we saw with Black Beauty. And three, that issues explored in 19th century texts continue to color the way we think about animals today. If you'd like to learn more about human-animal relationships in the 19th century, I've attached a few resources to this slide, including fiction by Arthur Conan Doyle and Margaret Marshall Saunders, a Canadian author whose book, Beautiful Joe, followed Black Beauty and won an award with the American SPCA, and an introductory book on 19th century human-animal relationships, The Animal Estate, the English and Other Creatures in the Victorian Age by Harriet Riffo, which is pretty much mandatory reading if you'd like to know more about 19th century animals. And I've also included a podcast about animal studies called Knowing Animals. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and I hope that you continue learning more about human-animal relationships.